When you look at the lines of the 1907 Roth-Steyr, you're like, what is this thing? But back then, we really didn't know what semi-automatic pistols were going to look like. This is a very interesting gun in terms of how it works and also how often it was used during the Great War.
Right in that last decade of the 19th century, right on the cusp of the 20th century, there was a lot of experimentation in semi-automatic designs for handguns. And as these designs progressed, they started getting some interest in European militaries as to the practical applications of these, particularly as it pertained to cavalry use. One of the early innovators and one of the financial backers for a lot of the experimentation and subsequent production was a man by the name of Georg Roth. Now, Roth was a designer himself, but more importantly, he brought the money and he brought the connections necessary to see some of these early designs through. He worked with a number of guys early on, particularly Vasa Theodorovic, and then later Karol Krenka. And Krenka is the man that is principally attributed to what eventually became the Roth-Steyr 1907 design. But there were a number of iterations leading up to that design before it really became the principal version adopted by the Austro-Hungarians in 1907.
The Roth-Steyr model 1907 fired an 8mm Steyr load, proprietary load. It was a lock breech. It was interesting in that it had an internal magazine. And to load the piece, you pull the slide back, lock the slide to the rear, and you had an interesting clip with kind of a sliding little plunger that actually pushed all the cartridges right down into the magazine. Pulled that out, closed the slide, and you were ready to go.
Interestingly enough, that if you wanted to unload the thing, you can't take the magazine out, there's a little button on the side, and when you have the slide lock back, you hit this button, and all of the cartridges just shoot out everywhere. It's like a cartridge volcano. The guns themselves were extremely well made. They were made by Steyr in Austria, and they were made by FEG in Hungary. And this became one of the standard sidearms of the Austrian forces. Of course, you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The gun was chambered in a somewhat anemic 8mm Steyr cartridge. But all in all, this is actually a fairly svelte pistol for a full-size service pistol.
When we get to the early 1900s, we're looking at governments all over the world trying to change to semi-automatics for their military. And one of the first ones to actually make that jump was the Austrians with the Roth-Steyr of 1907. And that gun was literally the first semi-automatic adopted by any military in the world. But the Roth-Steyr, even though it's lost to history today and to collectors because it shoots a cartridge that you can't buy over the counter at Walmart, it's lost its interest, at least on this side of the ocean.
Once the Austro-Hungarian Empire had adopted the pistol, it was made the mainstay of the K&K, the Austro-Hungarian army, the cavalry arm throughout World War I. At the end of World War I, they had to give thousands of them to the Italians as war reparations. The Italians actually ended up using them through World War II. And at the same time that they went to the newly established country of Yugoslavia, some were used in Poland, they were used in other countries in that basic region.
You know, most of the Roth-Steyr pistols were, of course, used by infantry, but there was also some use of them by the Austrian Air Force. There was a Flieger model of the pistol. Whether there's any difference between markings or not, I don't know, but it's kind of cool to say that the Air Force used it too. So again, this is a sort of a steampunk-looking gun, right? I mean, you know, we think of pistols today like the Colt 1911, which was adopted shortly thereafter, or the modern Glocks or the SIGs. You know, you have to realize in 1907, they weren't absolutely convinced of what should be a standard handgun. You know, they weren't wed to the magazine and the grip, even though this gun had it. But the lines of the guns had not been completely worked out yet, and that's very evident from the 1907 Roth-Steyr.
Roth-Steyr is a remarkable design for its time, particularly because it had a couple of unique features that we think of as being components of later handgun designs. And in fact, they were really pioneered in the Roth. This was a gun that was designed for cavalry use. And so they approached the design thinking about how it's going to be dropped, it's going to be jarred, it's going to face a lot of unique situations that other handguns aren't really going to face in a military setting. And what they come up with is really remarkable. The Roth-Steyr 1907 used a mechanism that didn't rely on a fully tensioned striker spring. And the whole idea behind this was that if you don't have stored potential energy in the operating mechanism, then there's less of a chance for it to be jarred and to dump that energy into firing a cartridge. And so while this is basically the principal component behind the modern day Glock safe action system, this really was pioneered in the first decade of the 20th century, which is pretty remarkable.